And so modernism, I'm going to finish up chapter 29. It is quite an extensive chapter. And I want you to take a look at this. This is not in the book, but it's going to be part of your quiz. So please pay attention. What we got here, this guy, Alfred Barr, he is the founder of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And it's one of the great museums of the world. And it shows exclusively modern art. And so back in the day, this was made in 1936. So it was like when my dad was like 2 years old. So bottom line, everybody, at least at the time, needed to know what all of this modern art was about. And I've told you a few times in here, I hope you remember that I've mentioned that after Impressionism, a lot of the artists and what they did really splintered into a lot of different styles, a lot of different movements, a lot of different concerns. And so we're setting up this museum, Alfred Barr, 1936, and he puts together this flow chart to kind of explain how all of this modern art came to be. And so let me walk you through some of this. He's got some of this up here, basically post-impressionism as we studied it today. Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cezanne, Seurat. And so these are the four of the post-impressionists that we begin this flow chart with. And so as I was talking about how Japanese prints actually influenced the artist in Paris in the late 19th century. This is why you got this here. And this really points to synthetism, which is really an old term for what Gauguin did. And it should have pointed here as well. But anyway, and it comes back around here to Fauvism. And if you remember, that was André Derain, Henri Matisse. And so we looked at all of this stuff. We looked at Expressionism, we looked at Futurism, we looked at Cubism. And as I was saying about Cubism, how it influenced so many other things, look at the arrows coming out of this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, more or less. And then some through this machine aesthetic. Remember I showed you Ferdinand Ligier, the three women, the city, and I showed you Fritz Lang's Metropolis, or at least I showed you the poster for that film. It was a silent film, but it was significant in art and significant in cinematic history. I digress. Orphism, the Delaunay's, suprematism, we haven't seen that yet. Constructivism, de style, neoplasticism. This is all the kind of stuff we'll see today. But we did see Dada. and we saw futurism. And so this chunk right here is what we're going to talk about today. And so I'll explain the quiz question at the end of this lecture time. But anyway, I got to add to something. I got to add something to this. And this chart was constructed to kind of put together an explanation of how we got to where we were back in 1936. And you see on the bottom here, these dates get to be pretty close to 36. And so he just kind of gives two end lines, two destination points, non-geometrical abstract art and geometrical abstract art. So it was kind of, everything was abstract, divided into two categories. And so the other thing I have to mention is much of this is theory. It is a connect the dots, but it's not often, it's not proven. It's like a thesis. Alfred Barr puts all of these things together when things kind of look alike, or they look like they were influenced by, say, an artist. So for instance, we got Van Gogh, we got Fauvism, we got Expressionism here. But there are a lot of people that would draw that line from Van Gogh right to Edvard Munch, the Scream. And like I say, this is a thesis. And scholars today do research on whether or not something like this thesis is actually correct. You follow me with that? In order for Van Gogh to have influenced Fauvism, you have to establish that Henri Matisse not only saw the work of Van Gogh, but actually it changed his artistic mindset, say. And so I've run into scholars from time to time, and they still work on a lot of this. Here we go, Cubism, and here we have what's labeled Negro sculpture, which is African art. And it's not a politically correct term, but it's how they thought in this time. But anyway, African sculpture, Cubism. I knew a guy from Scotland who was trying to prove that Picasso never saw any of this African art, that he supposedly, at least in theory, what's in most of the books, is that he copied or emulated or appropriated. And so he was tracing down through Picasso's journals, through his newspaper accounts, other kinds of things, his friends' journals, et cetera, to try to find out if Picasso had seen African sculpture, when and where did this happen? It's what scholars do. And likewise, a lot of this stuff, this is a thesis, and it's a pretty sound thesis as far as a thesis goes, partly because most all of these artists were centered in Paris. And so the likelihood of these artists connecting with each other was pretty substantial. Anyway, now that I've said that, let's take a look at the work. Not influenced directly from Paris, but knew what was going on. Kazimir Malevich, suprematist composition, airplane flying. Let me show you this. Suprematism, 1913, Moscow. And so what happens in this whole story of modern European art is that there are other places where artists are picking up on what's going on. I want to show you another thing about this. Where this leads to, in this kind of very convoluted manner, it ends up on geometrical abstract art. You see it is. It's basically a set of rectangles. Orange, yellow, black, blue. And this is airplane flying, and you might be able to read that in to this. But those Russians were really moving towards a more complete abstraction. And so representation is being brushed aside. And the Russians were, unbeknownst to most of the West, for a long time, were really right there at the avant-garde, the leading edge. Lyubov Popova, architectonic painting. Another, you see, doesn't even have a reference. It's not an airplane, it's not a person, it's a painting. It refers to itself. And you see, geometric abstraction. 1916, 1917. What happened with the Russian avant-garde is that many didn't survive. The Bolsheviks took over in 1917, and after that, it became slowly, it grew into a totalitarian state. Finally, when Lenin died, Joseph Stalin took over, and Stalin was very much against modern art. He thought it was a waste of time. He thought it was decadent. He thought it was intellectually flimsy and not artistic whatsoever. That being said, some of these artists got out. Some of these artists eventually were killed by Stalin. Malevich, who I just showed you, is reported to have died in 1935. We don't know exactly under what circumstances, but they had what they called the Stalinist purges, where Stalin would just start killing people he saw as political or cultural enemies, and just, you know, knock on their door in the middle of the night, and the secret police would just put a bullet through their head. Nam Gabo. This is called constructivism. And this is basically an abstract sculpture, and it's geometric, but the constructivists were really very interested in all of these new materials that were being produced. Perspex, wood, metal, and glass. Perspex. That's a kind of plastic. Before 1923, there really wasn't much plastic. The way that you get plastic comes from petroleum, and it goes through a refinement process. It's basically a petroleum byproduct. Bottom line, didn't have it before. But these artists celebrated all of these new materials, and they were very keen to use them in their sculpture. And again, they were very keen to create abstract work. And so this is circa 1923. It's reconstructed in 1937. And you see it's in the museum, the Guggenheim Museum. And so outside of Paris, we have this guy, George Groves, fit for active service. And you see these doctors examining what this is basically a corpse. And all of these military people are drafting him into military service. This was very much what a lot of the artists in Germany at the time, I showed you Hannah Hoch, they were anti-war, and we kind of label this in the realm of expressionism. And so here's another George Gross, and this is from 1926 in the years of the Weimar Republic. And what Gross believed, and what was basically true, was that the government was corrupt after the war in Germany. And so we have all of these rich people, these bankers, we have military heroes. You see the crucifix right here. But basically, we got a bunch of headless figures around here, and we got the bodies buried under all of this activity. We got the donkey with the blinders on. And what this was about, you see up here, if you can see that, the dollar sign. And according to Gross, there were really only a few motivators that would explain all of the corruption. First and foremost, greed. Second of all, a lot of his work has to do with power and sex. And so it's complicated. But bottom line, this is an anti-government statement. And another guy of this time, Max Beckmann. And this gets into what we would say is full-blown expressionism. And you see, it's a horrible painting. You see this figure tied her hands up. We got this torture. They're hanging this guy. It's all of this chaos and all of this horrendous injury to these people. It's awful. It's just titled Night, and it's from 1918, 1919. I would like to add that the St. Louis Art Museum has an extensive collection of Max Beckmann paintings. They were bought by the May family, who owned what used to be Famous and Bar. I don't know if you guys would remember that, but it was a big department store chain based in St. Louis. And so, anyway, but figures, color, shape, line, space, all distorted to evoke an emotional response from the viewer. Beckmann would say he would not like you to walk away from his paintings being unmoved. And certainly after seeing something as horrific as this, hopefully you would have been. Otto Dix, another German expressionist from this period. The war. See, First World War, if you lived in Germany at this time, that was everything. That defined everything. They just had fought World War I, and they lost. And the side that won, the side that the US and France and England were on, demanded war reparations, which meant that the Germans had to pay money. Their economy was gutted. The victors took away everything valuable. All of the means of agriculture, industrial production, a lot of things, all destroyed. Almost complete total devastation. And this is really what he's showing you. The war, Der Krieg. And so, and Ernst Ballrock, not only in painting, in sculpture, war monument. And what you see is this ghost-like figure hovering horizontally over this piece, which is kind of an empty space, gilded to be sure, very elaborate with a lot of cast iron decoration. But the dead represented here. And this was kind of an interesting concept in and of itself, because formally, before this time, most sculpture was on the ground. We didn't see anything like flying sculpture or hanging suspended sculpture. So yeah, that was kind of a new thing, but bottom line, it is a protest against the war. Surrealism. And this is a movement that almost everyone can appreciate and do appreciate. And it has everything to do with the ability to kind of connect exactly with what's going on in the work. This is Giorgio de Chirico, The Song of Love from 1914. And he is pretty much the father of what we would call landscape or pictorial surrealism, what you would call dreamscape surrealism. And so you see all of these objects, and they're painted in a very strange light. It's enigmatic. It means you don't really know what it is. It's kind of puzzling, disturbingly puzzling. But you see this is something that resembles a classical Roman or Greek sculpture. Rubber glove, a ball, the city deserted, no people around. I thought I had another one here. I just want to point out that this kind of dreamscape painting would take off. And de Chirico was somebody that a lot of these artists would look to. But in the meantime, there are other people doing surrealism, and it's basically dreamscape imagery. I said that a couple of times already. Dreamscape. What's happening with surrealism is that artists, if you will, have been looking for new things, hence modernism, doing something new. Well, one of the things that was kind of new and basically, for the most part, unexplored was the recesses of the human mind, the subconscious, if you will. And so they thought, and I think rightfully so, that there was a whole other reality that could be accessed while you're unconscious, while you are dreaming. And dreams can reveal things that are not in the world of the woke, if you will, but they exist in your dreams. And so I want to put this idea in your mind. By this time, psychology is really grown. Sigmund Freud was already established as the father of psychology, and he had people who were studying under him, and there were other psychologists emerging in this brand new field of the study of the human mind. And one of those followers was a guy named Carl Jung, Jung. And he was very interested in dreams. And he was very interested in human consciousness. And he really developed a lot of theories about how that all worked. What he put forward is that there is another consciousness, not our awake consciousness, but that consciousness we access when we dream. And he called that the universal subconsciousness. And sometimes it can be a personal kind of experience. But Jung went farther. He said it was a universal experience that transcended time and place. And he gathered a lot of evidence to support his theory. For example, he looked at some of the same things that you may have looked at when you studied prehistoric art. And he found that there was a lot of similarities between, say, the paintings at Lascaux in South Africa, the Apollo 11 caves in Australia. He also found that there were these signs, these symbols that seemed to appear all over the globe and from cultures that were not necessarily connected. For example, the swastika. We know that today as the Nazi symbol. It's on the Nazi flag and it's infamous. But before the 19th century, the swastika appears on all kinds of things. It appears in Buddhist and Hindu culture. Buddhist stupas are decorated with swastikas. It appears in Byzantine and medieval Christian churches, for example. It appears in the artwork of the Native Americans of the Southwest United States. And so we got this swastika and it's appearing all over the place. And that's just one example because he called those archetypes, and he was finding that there were many archetypes showing up all over the world in the artwork. The spiral, the five-pointed star, the six-pointed star, for example. And so anyway, this was really gaining traction, and a lot of these artists were very eager to explore the subconsciousness. And of course, Salvador Dali, The Persistence of Memory, 1931, one of the most famous paintings of the 20th century, derived from dream. And so you can kind of explain a lot of his work if you're thinking about the motivation, the dreamscape. And so what do you have? You have these appear in Dali paintings all the time, the ants. And that's kind of a metaphor for insects that will, in fact, eat you alive. They are ants. Ants will eat a lot of things. And that brings a lot of fear to a lot of people, especially people who have a phobia of insects. Look at the clocks, melted clocks appear all over Dali's work. Well, think about it. Time melts in this universal subconsciousness. Time really is malleable. It doesn't, in some ways, doesn't exist. And so we see melted clocks as a metaphor. And can I add some physics to the equation? Albert Einstein had already by 1931 published much of his important work about relativity, and he looked at time as the fourth dimension. And time could be warped. Time doesn't have to be particularly linear, and it can exist in different ways to different people at different places in time. So they would theorize, using Einstein's physics, that if you were traveling at the speed of light, you would not age. And you could travel for 25 years at the speed of light, come home, and be the same age you were when you left. Your twin sibling would be 25 years older, the one that stayed behind at work. On Earth, excuse me. One of the things that led Einstein to this theory was that he was famously pulling away from a train station in Switzerland. He was on the train and he was looking out the window and he saw the clock tower. And he started thinking about it. And he said, if this train was going the speed of light, that clock would not move. Think about it. Because by the time the light got to your eyes, it would be frozen because you would be moving away from it as fast as that image was getting to you, if that makes sense. At any rate, here we have this idea that not only is this a new area for artists to explore, it also fit with a lot of the scientific, the physics, and the psychology of the day. And so Salvador Dali, Rene Magritte, more surrealism. Magritte's a little different than Dali. This is called the treachery of images. And what this says is this is not a pipe, because it's a painting. It's a painting of a pipe. And so Magritte in his artwork actually starts to question images, and he questions language. Because quite honestly, language does not explain all of the phenomena. Of course, our language has developed in the last 100 years, or almost 100 years since this was painted. But the idea of trying to reframe what painting is and what painting does. And so this is the false mirror. Museum of Modern Art, as I would say. And there it is. It's an eye. And what you see behind it is the sky. And if you would think about the eye as the window to the soul, if you're so inclined to think that way, we think about the vast expanse, the clouds, the sky. The sky is gigantic, and it denotes a whole other reality, a whole other space, a whole nother environment. So anyway, yeah, I want to explain this too. Would you drink from this fur-covered cup and saucer and spoon? I don't hear any takers. One of the things that happens in surrealism, there's a lot of things, more than just a dreamscape that I just showed you. This is called a surrealist object. And basically what the artist would do would be to put together things that were incongruent. Why? Because in your dreams, nothing is incongruent. In reality, you can't put that square peg in the round hole. In your dreams, it fits perfectly. In your dreams, time is suspended, a la Salvador Dali. In reality, it is fixed. It progresses at a steady rate, so steady we can manufacture clocks to measure it, etc. But at any rate, this is something that would come out of a dream. And in some ways, if I may talk about how this could be of word association. And so if you would say spoon, cup, and saucer, what would be something that would be completely opposite, or something that would be antithetical to that? And you would maybe think about fur and put those two things together, because it comes out of your imagination or her imagination, and that is what surrealism is all about. It's what's going on upstairs. It's the mind. It's the consciousness. It's the subconsciousness. And yet another branch of surrealism is this. And this is Miro painting, 1933. And as the title says, it doesn't really represent anything. It is just a painting. And it is labeled as such. The interesting point is how this painting was generated. And it was generated by automatic drawing. It was generated by the artist standing in front of a large canvas and just drawing with a pencil or a marker or something, and just making random marks and producing random shapes, and then coming back in and filling in some of those shapes that were created randomly. The randomness is a product of trying to, maybe succeeding, connecting with the unconscious mind. He's not consciously trying to draw a person, place, or thing. He's letting his mind flow. And so that's how this is done. It's done through automatic drawing, and this is called automatic surrealism. So we got the surrealist object, and we got the dreamscape paintings. And so those are all three equally, legitimately surrealism. And so some of these other artists kind of get thrown into the mix, not really surrealism, but the twittering machine, which he creates this fantastic machine that's obviously got a crank and it's got mechanical birds and stuff, and it's actually kind of humorous. And again, it is a product of the subconscious mind. I want to add a little something here. A lot of these surrealists came out of Dada. As you remember, it was kind of an anti-art. It was a kind of a nonsensical art. But on further reflection, these same artists were reading Carl Jung and saying, you know, nothing's like truly random. He saw Jean art, collage, arranged according to the laws of chance. Is there really such a thing as the laws of chance? I've seen people that have followed that surrealist, that Dada surrealist connection, and they talk about having 3 coins and throwing the I Ching, tapping into the universal subconsciousness, capturing all of this knowledge that is out there in this vast universe, the universal subconsciousness. So anyway, a lot of things kind of come along with that. And a lot of those same Dada artists become surrealist. And so Wilfredo Lam, The Jungle, 1943, and you can see this is kind of generated, maybe much in a kind of way, at least partially, the way that Miro put together his paintings, but they are representational, and they have this little bit of cubist aesthetic too. Look at those masks and those faces, and the geometry and so on. Wilfredo Lam is from Mexico. I believe Mexico. He's from Spanish-speaking North America. And he was a guy that the surrealists just loved because they could see the degree of automatism, automatic drawing, spontaneity, and they could see some of these images that could be out of the universal subconsciousness, out of what was lying below the surface. And so that's that. I have geometric abstraction here just briefly. Piet Mondrian, composition with red, blue, yellow. One of the strategies, on the other hand, not surrealism, but this is called, they called it distyle. And a lot of people call this neoplasticism. But at any rate, this probably has more to do with Malevich and Namgabo than any of the surrealism, talking about those through lines. But at any rate, Mondrian wanted to kind of reduce painting down to just really 5 elements. White with a black grid line, yellow, blue, and red, the primary colors. Those are the 5 elements that you find in a Piet Mondrian composition. And this was by choice, by design, if you will, that it could reduce paintings to the basic elements. And so Mondrian, I was going to do this, so I knew we wouldn't have time for it. you can look up Mondrian and look on Google Images or something. This, this black and white grid with colors of yellow, blue, and orange. You can see that that's used in design all over the place. And I think it was the inspiration for the backdrop on the Rachel Maddow show, but don't quote me on that. Constantine Brancusi, sculpture, going much more abstract. The idea of just having, in this case, an egg and basic little manipulation of the shape. And his other one, this is one that's really very famous, Bird in Space, and it's bronze. And you can see it's reductive. It's reduced to a very simple yet elegant shape. And if you think about it, you've got that idea of a bird, you can almost see that proud bird standing tall. Barbara Hepworth, English sculptor. Again, basic quasi-geometric shapes. And in this case, the holes become part of the shape too. And if you guys ever just, take drawing classes or such, design classes, a lot is said about negative space. And these artists, these sculptors actually took that idea to heart and made positive shapes out of negative space, which was kind of interesting. Another guy who did this and did it mostly describing the human figure, Henry Moore. And all of the holes, the negative spaces create shapes too. And that actually, in some ways, come out of Cubism too. I showed you Picasso's guitar, the maquette. And so anyway, there's a lot of rethinking here. And I told you about the Soviet takeover of the arts in Russia. This is what suprematism and constructivism was replaced with in Russia, and that is this kind of art. Propagandistic art, it was called socialist realism, worker and collective farm woman. And they're united, working together to build a greater Russia. Anyway, that's kind of, and likewise in Germany, that the Nazis commissioned a lot of works that were very similar to this. Vladimir Tatlin, this is actually a model. It's a reconstruction of the model that was lost, but this was proposed as a building monument to the Third International. And this was supposed to be a skyscraper that would have dwarfed the Empire State Building. And it has different levels and different meeting places, almost like three buildings in one. This is a cylinder, that's a triangle, and that's a rectangular one, and there's one up here that's a hemisphere. But at any rate, this comes out of constructivism. And architecture follows some of the same ideas that we saw in Piet Mondrian and in Kazimir Malevich. And that is a reduction of the elements. And this one, Gerrit Rietveld, this is called the Schrader House, and this is designed completely after Mondrian's paintings. And if you see, you can see it. It's basically rectangles, and it's a grid, and it has just tiny bits of color. In this case, you can see the red, but there are other parts that are blue and yellow. But this is a Mondrian painting that is a house. And where a lot of this stuff happened was in the Bauhaus, and this is Walter Gropius, who was the leader of the Bauhaus movement, and this is their shop block. And for 1925 and 1926, this was like super modern, futuristic architecture. And so what Bauhaus did was try to synthesize all of the various arts, putting together craft, furniture design, architecture, sculpture, painting, and so on, and kind of put them all together for a shared aesthetic that was essentially modernist. And so we get stuff like this chair, which today doesn't look particularly modern, but for its time, 100 years ago, this was like Star Wars. And so we get, this is textiles, this is a tapestry, new ideas, and in a lot of ways, the same kind of patterning and no particular reference point, that is subject matter, people, places, or things. It's just kind of like Orphic Cubism inspired. And Mies van der Rohe, model for a glass skyscraper. And a lot of these people that I just showed you, including Le Corbusier, modernist architecture, design, clothing, painting, sculpture, clothes, shoes, everything. Bauhaus inspired. And much of what we have today came out of that school. Adolf Hitler, accompanied by Nazi commission members. This is what was called the show of degenerate art. And you see the word Dada up there. And all of these other, you got Max Ernst, George Groves that we just saw. They thought all of the stuff that we've been looking at was degenerate. As a matter of fact, by 1940, many of those same people, the architects, many of the painters, people like Salvador Dali, Piet Mondrian, Mies van der Rohe, a lot of these people came to New York because Hitler and the Nazis would have likely killed these people, sent them to concentration camps. And so there were two noted artists that stayed. Pablo Picasso, Henri Matisse. But they were so well known that the Nazis just kind of left them alone. But, you know, they hated modernism. It was completely antithetical to Nazism. So that's what I have. And okay, I have to go to assignments and this, and let me find my share screen there. Can you see this? That's that flow chart by Alfred Barr. And this is the quiz. The development of abstract art. And so this shows up funny on here. I'll read it to you. I think when you get to this, you can, it's cut off about 5 letters on this side. Based on what we studied, create a through line that connects an artist from the 1880s up here to an artist from the 1930s. Write a short description of characteristics of the artist's work, which connects to the next artist in your through line. Name at least 4 works in the through line. Think of it as the 4 degrees of Vincent van Gogh, taken out of the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. Just say it. Put it in a PDF, and it's due Monday at midnight. What I'm asking you to do is to put this together, and if you did choose Van Gogh, and then you choose Fauvism, you would get one of Van Gogh's works, and then one of these works, say who it was by and why it relates. There's a lot of different ways to go to get your 4 artists down to here. And so they could end up in Dada, or see, Dada Surrealism, Bauhaus, the style and neoplasticism, Piet Mondrian, constructivism, Namgabo, suprematism, Malevich, Orphism, Delaunay, futurism, Giacomo Balla, Picasso, etc. But connect them and tell me why they connect. Why I told you earlier about these are just theories. That's all I want. I don't need you to come give me documentation on when Picasso met, whoever, because Cubism goes all over the place, when he met the artist of the Bauhaus, or when he met the futurist, or any of that. I just want you to connect 4 dots from one of these down to this. So does that make sense? I'm thinking. And so anyway, due March 29th, we're keeping it open for another day. So Monday is when it's due. And that is the question. And so okay, well, I'm going to stop recording here, and